The morning my son-in-law turned to my daughter in the middle of breakfast and said, with that soft voice that sent shivers down my spine, that she was overreacting again, and my sister-in-law smiled over her coffee cup as if she had just watched something amusing, I felt something solidify inside me. Not anger. Not despair. Certainty. They thought they were sitting at the table with a 60-year-old woman who would stay quiet out of politeness, out of fear, out of a desire not to rock the boat. That was the most expensive mistake they ever made in their lives. But before we keep going, make sure you're already subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments, what city or state are you watching this video from? We love knowing how far our stories are reaching. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I am 60 years old and I live in Miami, in the Brickell neighborhood, in an oceanfront condo that my husband Arthur and I bought after 20 years of saving every single penny. Arthur passed away 4 years ago, taken by a cancer that moved too fast for any of us to have time to prepare. He left early on a Monday morning, with my hand in his, and the sound of the ocean outside as if the world didn't know that something essential had stopped. After he left, I learned that grief has no defined shape. Sometimes it shows up at breakfast, when you forget for a second that you're alone and pour 2 cups of coffee. Sometimes it shows up in the middle of a laugh, when you want to tell a joke to someone who is no longer there. I spent the first 2 years learning to live with that emptiness without letting it swallow me whole. It wasn't easy. It wasn't fast. But it was honest. I worked for 33 years as a clinical psychologist, focusing on family dynamics and crisis intervention. I treated hundreds of families over my lifetime. I saw patterns repeating with terrifying regularity, families where love and control blended so intimately that the people on the inside could no longer tell them apart. I learned that people rarely notice when they are caught in a destructive cycle because the cycle starts slowly, with kindness, with attention, with promises that look like love and only later reveal what they truly are. All that experience, everything I learned in decades of listening and observing, didn't stop me from taking far too long to see what was happening to my own daughter. And that delay, that blindness I thought I would never have, was the thing that weighed on me the most in everything we went through. Chloe is 35 years old. She's an architect, works at a residential design firm in Miami, and has a natural talent for transforming spaces into places where people feel good. Ever since she was little, she would rearrange her bedroom furniture, draw imaginary floor plans of houses she would one day build, and explain to me in detail why certain colors made people calmer or more anxious. She inherited her father's precision and my intuition, and that combination made her an extraordinary professional and a person who was always a gift to talk to. Before meeting Richard Sterling, Chloe was the kind of woman who filled any room with a presence that didn't need announcing. She would arrive, and things simply came alive. She debated, defended her ideas firmly, and laughed openly and without apology. She was the daughter who called me 3 times a week just to chat, who showed up at my door with pastries and stories from work, who never asked for permission to be exactly who she was. Richard entered her life 18 months after Arthur's death. They met at an architecture and urban planning symposium in New York City, where he was a keynote speaker. He was a construction industry executive, articulate, with the kind of confidence that comes from years of being the most important man in any room he walks into. When Chloe first told me about him, I noticed something in her tone of voice. She wasn't just excited. She was relieved. As if she had found a safe harbor after a long time drifting at sea. I should have paid closer attention to that relief. The relief that stems from grief can lead us to anchor at the first port that appears, without checking if the foundation is actually solid. His mother, Eleanor Sterling, was a widow living in Coral Gables, a 20-minute drive from Miami. She was the type of woman you can't openly criticize without looking unreasonable because she never says anything directly wrong. Every word is chosen with surgical precision. Every gesture has a layer of politeness that acts as armor. When I first met her, at an introductory dinner at a nice restaurant in Coconut Grove, she looked at me with those pale eyes and said that Chloe was a young woman with a strong personality. She said it smiling, her voice warm, as if it were a compliment. But there was something in the way she used the word strong that sounded like a warning disguised as admiration. The wedding took place in September, a beautiful beachfront ceremony in Key West. Chloe looked stunning, confident, happy in a way I wanted to believe was genuine. And maybe it was, in that moment. The problem is that what happens after the ceremony rarely resembles what happened during it. The ceremony is the invitation. The marriage is what you find when you walk through the door. In the months that followed, I started noticing little things. Chloe stopped mentioning new projects with enthusiasm. When I asked about work, she gave brief answers. The 3 times a week phone calls trickled down to once a week, then once every 10 days. When I asked why, she'd say she was busy, that marriage required adjustment, that everything was fine. But I knew my daughter. And I knew the difference between being busy and being stifled. On that Saturday morning when everything became clear, I had gone over to their house for a coffee date Chloe had suggested. The house was gorgeous, in a gated community in Pinecrest, with an indoor courtyard and tons of natural light. Chloe had decorated it with care, and I could see her touch in every detail. But something was different now. Everything was too perfect. Too controlled. Like a set designed to impress rather than a home where someone actually lives. A real home has imperfections. It has that dying houseplant someone forgot to water. It has a misplaced throw pillow. That house had none of that. Eleanor was there, which I hadn't expected. She had arrived earlier, unannounced, and settled into the living room with the natural ease of someone who doesn't need an invite because she already considers that space an extension of her own territory. Richard was talking about a new project, about expanding into the Tampa market, rattling off numbers and projections. Chloe listened. She didn't chime in, she just listened. When she did make an observation about the local real estate market, clearly based on years of professional experience, Richard didn't interrupt her. He did something worse. He smiled patiently, the way you listen to a child say something well-intentioned but completely wrong, and just kept talking as if she hadn't spoken at all. As if her voice were just background noise. Eleanor took a sip of her coffee and gave a slight nod, and in that tiny gesture was a message only someone paying close attention could read. A message approving the erasure. Chloe didn't repeat her point. She simply looked away toward the window. And in that gesture, in that averted gaze, I saw a resignation that wasn't new. It was practiced. It was old enough to have become a habit. I watched. I didn't say anything. I didn't stand up. I didn't reach for my phone. I sat there with my coffee cup, wearing the serene expression of a visiting mother, and I memorized every detail. The angle of Richard's body. Eleanor's smile. Chloe's posture, that slight slump of her shoulders that hadn't been there 2 years ago. Because that wasn't the time to act. It was the time to prepare. And I had a lifetime of preparation stored inside me, waiting for exactly this moment. Chloe grew up in a house where her opinion carried real weight. Arthur was the kind of father who truly listened, not with the forced patience of an adult waiting for a kid to finish talking so he can give the answer he's already decided on, but with a genuine attention that made Chloe feel her thoughts actually mattered. He never silenced her. He never belittled her ideas as too small to be taken seriously. From the time she was 6 years old, he treated her as someone whose thoughts were worth hearing. She was 8 when she decided her school needed a community garden and wrote a letter to the principal explaining the educational benefits of nature. The principal didn't grant the request, but Chloe wasn't crushed. She told me, with that childish seriousness that made me laugh internally while keeping a straight face, that she had done her part and now it was the principal's problem to live without a garden. She was 15 when she organized her classmates to remodel the school's student lounge with donated materials. She was 22 when she defended her senior thesis on emotional architecture, and the entire panel sat in silence for a few seconds before breaking into applause. She never needed approval to act. She expected respect, not permission. There's a massive difference between the two, and she always knew exactly where that line was drawn. When Arthur died, some of that confidence cracked. It didn't disappear, but it fractured in ways I could see but couldn't quite reach. Grief does that to people. It finds the places where you are strongest and softens them, not to break you, but to remind you that you're human, that strength has limits, that leaning on someone isn't a weakness. Chloe felt her father's death as the loss of an anchor, the kind of presence that makes you feel solid in the world simply by existing. And when Richard showed up with all that attention, with that way of listening to her that felt so familiar, she clung to it. I completely understand. I don't judge her for it for a single second. But I understand now that what looked like attention was actually an assessment. What looked like admiration was mapping. Richard learned what she needed to hear at the exact moment she needed to hear it, and he used that knowledge with a precision I only recognized when it was far too late. At the beginning of the relationship, he actively encouraged her. He went to her design presentations. He commented on her projects with seemingly genuine interest. He told her he admired her independence, that she inspired him, that he had never met a woman with such clarity of purpose. Chloe told me these things with a sparkle in her eye that made me so happy at the time, because she had spent over a year dimmed by grief, and seeing that spark return was a relief I didn't realize I'd been starving for. But over time, that admiration started coming with conditions, invisible on their own, but forming a clear pattern when viewed together. He admired her independence as long as it didn't interfere with their plans. He admired her work as long as it didn't make her more visible than him in social circles important to his business. He admired her strength as long as that strength wasn't directed against his decisions. The first suggestions came wrapped in concern, delivered in that calm, affectionate voice that was his signature. Maybe she was taking on too many projects for their first year of marriage. Maybe that specific client didn't fit the image they wanted to build together. Maybe she could postpone that business trip for a time when things were more settled at home. Maybe. 1, maybe a week sounds reasonable. 2, a week still feels like genuine care. But when you look back and count how many maybes have piled up, you realize there was nothing left she could do without running it through his filter first. Eleanor reinforced all of this with the silent efficiency of someone who had practiced for decades. She dropped by frequently, always with a good excuse, a homemade casserole or a gift for the house, always a concrete reason that made refusing the visit impossible without seeming rude. And while she was there, she talked about marriage, about what makes a union last, about priorities, about what it meant to be a good partner to a man carrying the kind of heavy responsibilities Richard carried. She never attacked directly. She planted ideas with the delicacy of a gardener sowing seeds in fertile soil, and then simply waited for Chloe to water them without realizing what she was cultivating inside herself. I really started noticing when Chloe stopped disagreeing with Richard in front of me. Before, she would counter his points naturally, just like she did with anyone else, not out of hostility, but because that's how she processed the world, through dialogue, questioning, and honest debate. Then, she started agreeing. Or staying silent. And her silence had a different texture than the silence of someone deep in thought. It was the heavy silence of someone who learned that speaking up came with a price tag she sometimes couldn't afford to pay. One afternoon, I dropped by their house unannounced. Chloe opened the door with an expression that took 2 seconds to adjust, 2 seconds where I saw something she didn't want me to see. When I asked if everything was okay, she said yes with a rushing speed that answered the question entirely differently than her words did. She was wearing a long-sleeved shirt on an intensely hot Miami day. It was 105 degrees outside. The AC was running in the apartment she herself had decorated with plants and light fabrics because she hated freezing artificial air. I didn't ask any more questions that day. But I logged it. I was storing everything away with the care of someone who knows that one day, they'll need to piece together the entire puzzle. Control doesn't start with screaming. It doesn't start with bruises. It starts quietly, almost politely, like a fog that rolls in without warning until you can no longer see where it began. And when you're inside that fog, anyone who tries to show you what's happening looks like the threat, not the person who built the walls around you. That's why I waited. That's why I watched. That's why I saved every single piece. That day was coming. I just didn't know yet how much worse it was going to be than I imagined. The first hard proof that the situation had escalated beyond psychological control arrived on a Thursday afternoon when Chloe called me from work. I didn't recognize her voice immediately. It wasn't the voice of someone crying. It was worse. It was the voice of someone who has pushed past the point where crying is even possible and arrived at a colder, emptier, dangerously numb place. She told me she had been called into the office by the firm's senior partner. She was informed that some clients had filed complaints about her professional conduct. Vague complaints, no names, no specific incidents, about emotional instability, poor communication, and inappropriate behavior in meetings that she couldn't even pinpoint because none of it had ever happened. She had no idea where this was coming from. Years of flawless work without a single critique, without one unhappy client, and suddenly this. I understood before she even finished speaking. I didn't say it to her then. I just listened with every ounce of attention I possessed. I asked if she knew who filed the complaints. She said no, they were anonymous. I asked if there was any client she had recently disagreed with, anyone holding a grudge. She went quiet for a moment and then named a development company. A company whose owner, I discovered later through a discreet search, had a long-standing business partnership with Richard. I hung up the phone feeling that what I had been calling a mother's paranoia had stopped being a possibility and had become an agonizing certainty. It's a specific kind of pain, the pain of being right about something you desperately prayed you were wrong about. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my condo's balcony, listening to the ocean and organizing everything I knew using the methodology I had honed over decades. When you work with families in crisis, you learn that disorder is rarely chaotic. It has logic. It has strategy. And when you find the logic behind the chaos, you find the way through it. What was happening to Chloe had a structure I recognized with painful clarity. First, the internal isolation, alienating her from her own convictions, making her doubt her instincts and judgment. Then, the external isolation, weakening connections with people who might validate her reality, friends who drifted away, colleagues who suddenly had less time. And now, professional isolation, attacking the one space where she still had her own identity, where she was still recognized for her expertise, where she still felt whole. Richard didn't need to yell. He didn't need to make explicit threats. He had far more effective tools, ones that were much harder to prove. He had access, he had connections, he had a network that operated quietly in service of his interests. And he had Eleanor, who I increasingly realized was not just a difficult mother-in-law, but a completely active, conscious player in this system. The following week, I asked Chloe to meet me at a coffee shop she used to love before she got married, in Coconut Grove, far from Pinecrest, far from Richard's territory. She arrived 15 minutes late, which was entirely unlike her, wearing a look of exhaustion that went way beyond physical fatigue. It was the exhaustion of someone who has spent too much time in a state of high alert, the kind of bone-deep weariness that settles into your marrow. I didn't beat around the bush, but I wasn't direct either. In 33 years of practice, I've learned that going straight to the point when someone is that vulnerable rarely works out the way you hope. The person retreats, defends their abuser with terrifying conviction, and you lose the very channel of communication it took months to build. Instead, I asked about her. About her work before all this drama. About what used to excite her in her field when she was younger. About the nonprofit project she had mentioned months ago with that spark in her I recognized from her childhood. Something began to open up in her as she spoke. Not all at once, but slowly, like a window being cracked open millimeter by millimeter with extreme care. She talked about the project with an energy that reminded me of who she used to be. It was an affordable housing complex she had designed pro bono, before the marriage, before all of this. As she talked, her eyes grew slightly brighter, and in those eyes, I saw my real daughter fighting her way back to the surface. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and that opening snapped shut. Not violently, but visibly, like a flower closing when the temperature drops. She put the phone away, offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said she needed to leave earlier than planned. Richard needed her at home. When she left, I stared at her half-full cup and felt a mix of urgency and restraint, one of the hardest emotional balancing acts to sustain. The urgency screams that you have to act now. The restraint knows that acting without preparation can destroy the exact thing you're trying to save. I started documenting everything that week with my decades-old methodology. Dates, times, observations, context. Every detail Chloe had mentioned over the months, everything I had witnessed firsthand, every inconsistency that lacked a reasonable explanation. I called two of Chloe's friends who had vanished after the wedding. One told me she had distanced herself because Richard made it clear, in ways she couldn't exactly define but were absolutely unmistakable, that she wasn't welcome. The other didn't answer but texted me later saying she was afraid to get involved. That word stopped me dead in my tracks. Afraid. A 30-year-old friend of my daughter was afraid to get involved. That told me everything I needed to know about the scale of what I was up against. The message arrived on a Friday morning while I was brewing coffee. An unknown number, no saved name, just a direct sentence with no context. It simply read, "I need to talk to you about Richard Sterling." Not over the phone. I stared at that text for a long time, weighing every possibility. In my line of work, you learn to tell the difference between a genuine tip and a trap. I learned that when you start threatening the control of someone who operates like this, they react, and the reaction isn't always head-on. Sometimes it comes disguised as an ally, an informant, someone who wants to help, but is actually mapping out what you know and what you're planning. But there was something in the way the message was written that didn't feel like a trap. No theatrics. No manufactured urgency. No promises of explosive revelations. It was the message of someone who had thought long and hard before pressing send, someone weighing the risk of reaching out just as heavily as I was weighing the risk of replying. I texted back, asking to meet in a public place. I chose a plaza in Coral Gables on a Sunday afternoon, when there's enough foot traffic for a conversation to stay private, but no one is completely isolated. Her name was Sarah. She was in her early 40s, with a short haircut and a way of holding her purse in her lap that instantly reminded me of someone who had learned to always be ready to leave in a hurry, that posture of never fully resting your weight anywhere. She had worked as Eleanor's personal assistant for almost 4 years, managing her schedule, correspondence, and the elaborate events Eleanor hosted for her meticulously curated social network. Sarah didn't show up with a dramatic sob story. She showed up with facts. Exact dates. Names. And a memory that proved she had spent years observing in silence, hoarding details she didn't know the purpose of, but that her gut told her needed to be saved. She had been fired after asking questions about some financial transactions that didn't add up. Not accusatory questions, just practical inquiries from someone trying to do their job right. That was all it took. Within a week she was out, handed a letter of recommendation clearly drafted to avoid outright sabotage but vaguely enough to keep doors firmly shut. A document that spoke volumes through what it left unsaid. What she told me over nearly 2 hours in that plaza fundamentally changed the shape of what I thought I was fighting. It changed the scale. It changed the depth. Eleanor wasn't just a difficult, controlling mother-in-law. She had spent decades building and maintaining a control system that operated in well-defined tiers. Over the women Richard brought home. Over employees. Over anyone who could represent an outside influence on the inner circle she commanded. She had contacts in various industries, people who owed her favors or feared what she knew about them. And she utilized those contacts with a ruthless efficiency that Sarah described as completely cold and emotionless, like a CEO running a corporation. Richard had been married before. To a woman named Vivian, who had filed for divorce 3 years before he met Chloe. Vivian had simply fallen off the face of the earth once the divorce was finalized, no public explanation, no contact with anyone she knew from before the wedding. Sarah didn't know the whole story, but she knew the divorce was pushed through rapidly, and Vivian had signed a settlement that included an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. My stomach dropped with a heaviness that wasn't surprise. It was the confirmation of something I had dreaded but refused to name out loud. Before she left, Sarah slid a flash drive across the table. She said it contained copies of communications she had backed up over the years, saved with the instinct of someone who doesn't know when they'll need the receipts, but knows the day is coming. She told me to use it carefully. That she had reached a point where staying silent carried a moral toll she was no longer willing to pay. I drove home with that flash drive in my purse and a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt since this nightmare began. That night, sitting at my dining table with my laptop open and the ocean crashing outside, I opened the files one by one, with the solemnity of someone unsealing something that can never be closed again. There were emails. There were audio recordings of conversations Sarah had captured with the sheer survival instinct of someone who knew they'd need proof. There were documents exposing a pattern that spanned years, not months. And Vivian's name was scattered across several of those files, with details indicating she had walked away from that marriage bearing scars that went far beyond the emotional. I shut my laptop at 3 a.m., walked to the window, and stared out at the Atlantic. I thought about Arthur. I thought about what he would say. He would say that sometimes, protecting the people we love requires us to be braver than we feel capable of being. He would say it in that steady, calming voice that always made the impossible seem within reach, just waiting for us to step up. The next morning, I called my lawyer. My lawyer's name is Jessica Hayes. We had collaborated on several cases over the years when my clinical psychology work intersected with legal proceedings requiring psychological documentation. She was sharp, direct, and possessed the rare ability to listen to a wildly complex situation without trying to oversimplify it before she grasped the whole picture. I had never needed that ability more than I did that morning. We met early at her office in the Brickell Financial District. I brought everything, the notes I had kept over the months, the files from the flash drive, what Chloe's friends had confided in me, the specifics of the sabotage at her firm. Jessica listened without interrupting once, jotting notes on the legal pad she always kept open in front of her, the same pad where I had watched her distill entire family crises into clean, actionable bullet points that later became airtight legal strategies. When I finished, she sat in silence for a few seconds, reviewing her notes. Then she looked up and said we had more than enough material to file for emergency protective orders, but that the trickiest part wasn't the law. It was getting Chloe to a place where she wanted and requested that protection herself. Because without Chloe as an active, willing participant in the process, any external intervention could be weaponized against us, painting me as an overbearing mother disrespecting her adult daughter's choices. I already knew that. And it was the exact dilemma that had been keeping me awake every night since this all started. I spoke with Chloe 3 times that week. No pressure, no heavy undertones of the secrets I was carrying. We talked about mundane things, her condo, a new design exhibit that had opened in Coconut Grove, a pound cake recipe she had asked me for years ago that I had never written down. I was building a bridge between us, brick by brick, before I tried to drive a truck across it. During the third conversation, I casually brought up the nonprofit project. The one she had talked about at the coffee shop with that familiar childhood spark. She went quiet for a moment, then recited that she had discussed reviving it with Richard, and he felt the timing wasn't right. That she was still adjusting to the responsibilities of marriage. That volunteer projects drained energy that should be focused on their home life. She recited those sentences with a cadence I instantly recognized wasn't hers. It was Richard's rhythm. Those words had been spoken to her so many times that she had started speaking them as her own, completely oblivious to the fact that she was acting as the mouthpiece for her own cage. In that moment, I decided it was time to shift gears. No accusations. No grand reveal she might not be ready to process. Just a question. One simple question. I asked her when was the last time she had made a decision, any decision, entirely on her own, without consulting Richard first. The silence that followed stretched too long to just be a thoughtful pause. And that silence held more of an answer than any words could convey. She finally said she didn't understand what I was asking. But her trembling voice told an entirely different story. I didn't push any further that day. But I left the question hanging in the air, like planting a seed in soil that isn't completely ready yet, but has exactly what it needs to eventually break ground. Meanwhile, Jessica had tracked down Vivian. She was living in Charleston, South Carolina now, remarried, with a 2-year-old daughter. When Jessica reached out, treading incredibly lightly, explaining who she was and why she was calling, Vivian remained silent for a long time before admitting she had been waiting for this exact phone call. She had waited years for it. She had rehearsed what she would say 1,000 times, and had eventually given up hope that the moment would ever come. She agreed to talk. under strict conditions and legal shields that Jessica made sure were ironclad before any deep dive occurred. And what she detailed over the course of 2 hours-long conversations validated everything Sarah's flash drive suggested. It went even further, providing granular details that proved to me that what had happened to her was exactly what would happen to Chloe if I didn't strike with perfect precision, at the exact right moment. Richard had run an almost identical playbook on Vivian. The intense, intoxicating attention in the beginning. The gradual restrictions gift-wrapped in concern. The isolation that crept in so slowly she only grasped its magnitude when she looked around and realized everyone was gone. The terrifying tipping point where psychological pressure morphed into physical intimidation. And Eleanor looming in the background, always in the background, orchestrating, shielding, ensuring the perimeter remained tightly sealed under her watchful eye. Vivian said something that haunted me for days, something I still think about constantly. She said the hardest part wasn't leaving. The hardest part was convincing herself that the nightmare she was living was real. Because when you're trapped inside it, everything feels normal. The walls feel like security. The cage feels like home. And anyone trying to yank you out into the harsh light of reality feels like an enemy trying to rob you, not a savior trying to rescue you. When I ended the call after hearing that, I walked to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the mattress. I pictured a 7-year-old Chloe, sleeping with her arm slung over a teddy bear named Snickerdoodle. I remembered how she learned to ride a bike without training wheels, simply declaring with absolute, unquestionable childish conviction that she trusted her own balance. She had trusted her own balance her entire life. Someone had spent the last 2 years methodically brainwashing her into believing that balance was a total illusion. It was time to remind her that it never was. Richard's counteroffensive hit sooner than I anticipated, which signaled that he sensed a shift in Chloe's orbit, that the airtight control he had painstakingly engineered was hitting friction somewhere he couldn't quite pinpoint. The first strike came through Chloe herself. She called me one afternoon, her voice tight, saying Richard was feeling concerned about how frequently we'd been talking lately. That he felt I was having a negative influence on her, disrupting the stability they were trying to cultivate. That maybe it would be best if we took a break from our visits for a few weeks, just to let things settle. I spotted the maneuver without needing a second to think. When the external isolation phase is deeply entrenched and someone threatens to breach it, the abuser's next move is to attack the source of the breach. Paint the rescuer as the villain. Force the victim to be the messenger of their own isolation, so the distancing appears to be their own choice. I answered calmly that I understood, that I would respect her boundaries, and that she knew exactly where to find me whenever she needed me. I didn't push. I didn't argue. I didn't let a shred of the agony I was feeling bleed into my voice. Because arguing in that moment was exactly the trap Richard had laid, it would have handed him the perfect ammunition to prove his narrative that I was an overbearing, destabilizing force. Then the attacks came from other directions, more insidious, and therefore much harder to definitively fight off. A colleague I knew from a clinical supervision group called me, clearly uncomfortable, to relay that a mutual acquaintance had implied I was mixing personal vendettas with professional diagnostics in some unspecified case. Nothing concrete. Just shadowy rumors shaped enough to cause friction but too vague to officially debunk. An anonymous post popped up in a South Florida mental health professionals Facebook group, raising ethical concerns about an unnamed psychologist interfering inappropriately in family disputes. Anyone reading it who knew me might connect the dots. It was just enough to generate static. These were preemptive strikes designed to poison the well of my credibility, ensuring that if and when I finally spoke out, my words would already be tainted by suspicion. It was the exact same playbook he had used against Chloe at her architectural firm. No direct accusations, no specific inciting incidents, just enough background noise to make the ground beneath my feet feel shaky. I didn't panic. I documented every single incident using my standard methodology. And I kept moving forward. Jessica had begun assembling our arsenal strategically, clicking every puzzle piece into place before making a single visible move. Sarah's files, Vivian's sworn statement, the paper trail of the sabotage at Chloe's firm, the timeline of messages I had archived over the months. There was a glaring red thread connecting it all, and that thread had a first and last name. But any legal nuclear strike without Chloe standing firmly at the launch controls would fizzle out. And to get her there, she had to reach a breaking point she hadn't quite hit yet. I drove out to her house on a morning I knew Richard was in Tampa for a 2-day site visit. I found Chloe out in the courtyard, watering the plants with the vacant stare of someone whose body is doing chores while their mind is galaxies away. When she spotted me, she froze for a split second, and in that micro-expression, the internal war was laid bare. One half of her wanted to shoo me away, exactly as she had been programmed to do. The other half, the daughter I had known for 35 years, wanted to sprint over and hold on to me for dear life. We sat down in the courtyard. I didn't mention Richard. I didn't bring up the mountain of evidence I was sitting on, or Vivian, or Sarah, or the storm Jessica was brewing in the shadows. I asked about her. Not the house, not the marriage. Her. What was she feeling? What had she been dreaming about lately? What did she actually want, when she allowed herself to want without running it through a filter? She took a long time to answer. It was the hesitation of someone who was no longer used to forming thoughts out loud without first running them through an internal checkpoint to ensure the words were safe. When she finally spoke, it was agonizingly slow. She said she was tired in a way that sleeping didn't fix. She said she kept waking up at 3 a.m. with a sinking feeling that she had forgotten something critically important, but couldn't remember what it was. She said she missed feeling competent at her job. That last sentence broke my heart in a way I absolutely refused to show on my face. My brilliant daughter, who had been universally praised for her excellence her entire adult life, had been reduced to a woman who felt incompetent, simply because a man had spent 2 years whispering, in 1,000 subtle, unpointable ways, that her own mind couldn't be trusted. I reached out, grabbed both of her hands, and said one thing. Just one. I told her she was still the exact same little girl who learned to ride a bike without training wheels because she trusted her own balance. I told her that balance was still right there inside her, exactly where it had always been. That no one on earth has the power to surgically remove what is fundamentally inside of you. They can only trick you into believing it's gone. She stared at me for a long time, looking at me with her father's eyes. And then she broke down. Not the stifled, ashamed weeping I had witnessed over the last few months, but a real, guttural, chest-heaving cry, the kind that violently erupts from a vault that has been locked shut for way too long. In that Pinecrest garden, over the distant hum of Miami traffic, I felt the tectonic plates shift. It wasn't cinematic, but it was real, and it was permanent. Chloe called me 2 days later, initiating the contact herself, asking to meet. She walked into my condo on a sweltering afternoon clutching a small notebook I didn't recognize, wearing a facial expression I hadn't seen in ages. She was terrified, yes. But underneath the terror was a steely resolve that I instantly recognized as her true self. She had started writing. Not a diary, she made sure to clarify that, but a list. Every single time she had abandoned something she loved because Richard had suggested it wasn't a good idea. Every time she had folded on an argument, not because she agreed, but because fighting back carried a tax she was too exhausted to pay. Every time she had zipped herself into long sleeves on a brutally hot 105-degree Miami day. She set the notebook down on the coffee table between us and looked me dead in the eye. The list spanned 4 pages. I didn't need to say a word. The ink on those pages screamed everything that needed to be said. I spoke to her that afternoon the same way I had spoken to the most critical patients of my career, with absolute, unhurried presence, carrying no agenda other than giving her exactly what she needed in that moment. I briefed her on Vivian without weaponizing the gruesome details to manipulate her. I laid out the psychological pattern the same way I would whiteboard it for a client, not to brainwash her, but to elevate her high enough to see the maze from a bird's eye view, instead of panicking inside the dead ends. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat in a heavy silence that I respected completely. Finally, she quietly admitted that a piece of her still desperately wanted to believe her situation was different. That the love, at least in the beginning, had been real. That maybe, with enough therapy and talking, things could genuinely change. I validated that feeling without a single ounce of judgment. I told her that the love very well might have been real, that genuine emotions frequently exist inside violently toxic dynamics. That hoping for change isn't a sign of weakness or stupidity. It's proof of humanity. But I also told her that real love does not use fear as a leash. Real love doesn't gag you. It doesn't shrink you. Real love doesn't leave bruises that require long sleeves in the dead of a Florida summer. She flipped to the back page of the little notebook and showed me something she had written separately from the master list. It wasn't a list of what she had surrendered. It was a manifesto of what she intended to take back. The nonprofit housing project. Her estranged friendships. The luxury of debating ideas without meticulously weighing every syllable before opening her mouth. The sheer thrill of being undeniably excellent at her job. The freedom to pick an outfit in the morning without dreading an evaluation. That page was the starting line. It was the blueprint of everything she knew was still rightfully hers. Jessica dropped the hammer the following week, the moment Chloe officially retained her and signed off on the legal offensive. It was an absolute blitzkrieg, executed with flawless precision before Richard or Eleanor even registered a blip on the radar. Temporary restraining orders, massive evidentiary files arranged chronologically, and aggressive formal inquiries sent to the state licensing board regarding the fabricated complaints that had nearly torpedoed Chloe's career. Richard was completely blindsided. Predators who operate in the shadows, relying on agonizingly slow attrition, are rarely prepared for the silence to be shattered with a supersonic boom. When he was served, the whiplash was instant. He bombarded Chloe with texts swearing he was a changed man, begging for a sit-down, weaponizing the real love they shared. When she ghosted him, the texts morphed into thinly veiled threats. When she finally replied with a sterile message directing all contact to Jessica's law firm, reality hit him. He was reading from a script he no longer controlled. Eleanor scrambled to deploy every asset in her arsenal. Flying monkeys from her socialite circle suddenly started texting Chloe with concerned advice. She attempted to ambush the Brick Hill condo, only to be stonewalled by condo security enforcing the active restraining order. She even called my cell phone directly, using that icy, flawlessly polite tone she reserved for delivering blatant threats wrapped in country club manners. I answered. I listened. I calmly informed her that all communication must be routed through legal counsel. I hung up. I documented it. I spent those weeks hovering around Chloe, balancing the tightrope of being fiercely present while giving her room to breathe. She was detoxing from a very specific, non-linear kind of trauma, the soul-crushing realization that someone she had handed her entire heart to had used it as a treasure map to locate and exploit her deepest vulnerabilities. It's a devastating mind trip because it doesn't just make you question the abuser, it makes you question your own sanity, your own ability to accurately judge reality. I told her something I've told trauma survivors for decades, something I believe in my bones. Being manipulated by a master narcissist is not a symptom of stupidity. It means you possessed exactly what they needed to steal: trust, empathy, generosity, the capacity to love without demanding a receipt. Hollow people hunt for those exact qualities because they are incapable of generating them naturally. They have to parasitize them from the living. The defect was never in her. Not for a single fraction of a second. Sarah gave a devastating sworn deposition, her clarity sharpened by years of biting her tongue. Vivian submitted a bulletproof affidavit from Charleston, radiating the profound relief of finally screaming the truth into a microphone that mattered. And the mountain of receipts Sarah had quietly hoarded dropped onto the judge's desk with an undeniable, deafening thud. The matrix they had operated for so long, the cocktail of invisible coercion, systematic isolation, and iron-fisted narrative control, slammed into a brick wall of resistance at every single turn. And when a parasitic system hits total resistance, it starves. Chloe sat face-to-face with Richard exactly one time. A formal, heavily regulated mediation session in a downtown conference room, flanked by Jessica and a court-appointed mediator. She demanded the meeting herself. Not to bargain. Not to stomach the calculated apologies she knew he would deliver with Oscar-worthy conviction. She did it to look him in the eye and state her reality out loud. For him, yes, but mostly for herself. To hear her own voice declare the absolute truth in a heavily guarded room where he legally could not interrupt her, gaslight her, or warp her reality. I waited out in the lobby. She asked me to, and I agreed without a second thought. That arena was hers. It had always been hers, even during the dark months when she couldn't find her own reflection, even when the fog was so suffocating she stopped trying to navigate. When she walked through those double doors 45 minutes later, her entire physical frequency had shifted. It wasn't exactly lightness comes later, gradually, the way all authentic healing arrives. It was density. It was the unshakable, grounded gravity of a woman who just stared down the devil who had spent 2 years telling her she was crazy, and firmly told him to go to hell. She debriefed me later. He had run the entire gauntlet, performing the classics with the slick polish of a seasoned con artist. The shared blame tactic. The perfectly timed, single tear that almost looked real because, on some deeply disturbed level, maybe it was. The "our love was so beautiful" speech she had predicted and mentally armored herself against. The hyper-specific promises of couples counseling and doing the work. To every single manipulation, she found the anchor inside herself. She didn't argue to convince him. She spoke to solidify herself. At one point, he reached his hand across the mahogany table toward hers. She simply raised a flat palm and said, "No." That was it. Just no. No apologies, no softening the blow, no explanations. And for the first time in 2 solid years, the no landed without being dismantled. The legal machinery chewed through them with a speed that left Richard and Eleanor reeling. They were accustomed to playing the long game, relying on exhaustion, banking on the fact that victims eventually run out of money or sanity and just fold. But when you walk into the arena armed with airtight documentation, fearless witnesses, a merciless attorney who knows exactly where the jugular is, and a client who is fully, fiercely awake, time suddenly switches teams. The smear campaign at Chloe's firm was fully investigated and nuked from orbit. She walked back into her office to a groveling apology from the senior partners, cementing the fact that her work was, and had always been, untouchable. The non-profit housing project was resurrected, not as some hollow symbol of getting her groove back, but simply because she genuinely wanted to build it, and she finally lived in a reality where she could want things without requesting clearance. Eleanor's empire crumbled. It took a little longer, but it collapsed with the inevitable gravity of a mansion built on quicksand suddenly exposed to a hurricane. Selected files from Sarah's flash drive found their way to key players at the exact right moments. The extortion-light network of social debts and leveraged secrets she had curated for decades evaporated the second her high society friends realized that being publicly associated with her was now a massive liability. It wasn't a screaming match in the street. It was the quiet, total demolition that happens when you strategically kick out the load-bearing pillars of a corrupt foundation. Today, Chloe lives in a gorgeous apartment in Coconut Grove. She picked it out entirely on her own, using the exact architectural criteria she's always valued: flooding morning sunlight, high walkability, and massive trees framing every window. It's much smaller than the Pinecrest compound. There's no sprawling courtyard. But it features massive floor-to-ceiling windows that she throws wide open whenever the Miami breeze allows. She jokes that the wind is part of the interior design, that a space that physically breathes is a space where a human being can finally catch their breath. She meticulously rebuilt the friendships that had withered during the marriage. No grand gestures, no awkward forcing of the issue. She approached them with the quiet grace of someone who knows that bonds surviving brutal winters grow back with a tensile strength they never had before. Her friends rallied around her. Some cried, some raged on her behalf over the stolen years, but every single one of them exhaled a massive sigh of relief at having the real Chloe back in the room. She's pouring her soul into the nonprofit project with a ferocious energy that blasts me right back to her college days, when she radically believed that physical environments held the power to heal human trauma. That faith is back. It's not the naive optimism of her 20s, it's battle-tested now. It has scars, grit, and a hyper-awareness of how incredibly difficult it is to engineer truly safe spaces. But the fire is completely reignited. She's aggressively single right now, and it's a fiercely conscious choice, not a byproduct of trauma. We were drinking coffee on my balcony a few weeks ago, staring out at the Atlantic, when she told me she's learning to be fiercely whole on her own before she ever considers letting someone else into her orbit. She admitted that for a long time, she had confused the desperate feeling of needing an anchor with the actual feeling of love. She wants to master the difference before she ever dates again. She wants her next relationship to be built on overflowing abundance, not a desperate attempt to fill a void. To me, that conversation was the ultimate proof. She didn't just survive the gauntlet. She walked through the fire, climbed out the other side, and brought back a level of profound, hardened wisdom that you can only acquire by hitting rock bottom and clawing your way back to the surface. As for me, I am putting this story out into the world because I made a blood oath to myself that I would not let it fade into the polite, country club silence that protects abusers and isolates victims. I am writing this for the daughters out there right now, living exactly what Chloe lived, who haven't yet found the vocabulary to define their nightmare. I'm writing this for the mothers out there, staring across the dinner table at their little girls, feeling that sickening, familiar pit in their stomachs, that terrifying intuition that society constantly tries to gaslight us into dismissing as overbearing mom syndrome. I am writing this to tell you that your gut is practically never wrong, that the chaos you are witnessing has a rigid blueprint, and that blueprints, once dragged out into the harsh light of day, can be dismantled with the right cocktail of calculated patience, ruthless documentation, and an absolute refusal to shut up. Control doesn't start with screaming. It doesn't start with bruises. It starts silently, politely, like a toxic fog rolling under the doorframe until you literally cannot remember what the sun looks like. And escaping that fog is rarely a Hollywood action sequence. It starts with one jarring question asked over coffee. It starts with a scribbled list in a notebook at 4 a.m. It starts with a Tuesday afternoon in a garden, where someone finally breaks down and cries real tears for the first time in years. It starts with one person looking at the board and refusing to accept that surrender is the only move left. It starts with someone deciding that sitting quietly, watching, documenting, and preparing is actually a lethal form of warfare, perhaps the most lethal form of all. If this story triggered something deep inside your chest, I need you to know that the suffocating weight you are feeling has a clinical name. The madness you are experiencing is a highly structured game. And manipulative structures, the moment they are exposed to blinding light, instantly lose the power they required the darkness to maintain. The truth hits like a freight train when it's spoken out loud, to the right people, at the exact right second. And sometimes, the most critical person you need to say it to is the person staring back at you in the bathroom mirror on a random Tuesday morning, looking at your reflection and finally deciding, this is not how my story ends. Sometimes justice doesn't show up with sirens and a SWAT team. Sometimes it arrives with the exact same dead silence the abuser used to inflict the trauma, quietly systematically dismantling their entire life. The thing that survives the wreckage isn't revenge. It's the unvarnished truth. And the truth possesses the terrifying power to resurrect everything it touches, especially the person brave enough to finally speak it. Now, if you like this story, smash that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments, Which part of this story left your jaw on the floor? Oh, and don't forget to become a channel member for exclusive access to videos I don't post anywhere else. I'll see you there.